Hello and welcome to the New Orchard Show. If you like me work in a corporate environment, you might have noticed over the last few months, or maybe a year, like I've noticed, a flurry of HR activity inviting all employees to undergo not quite mandatory, but highly recommended neurodiversity in the workplace training. Just like that, out of the blue, the entire corporate world seems to be obsessed talking about the overall benefits of having a neurodivergent workforce. Just like that, a massive number of consultants and all kinds of facilitators flooded into the system and aiming to educate their management and the staff, recommending things like increased tolerance, open mind, and creation of space for people who engage with the world differently, who think differently and create differently. As a sentiment steeped in a kind of limitless empathy, it'd be hard to take issues with it. After all, people with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other conditions are out there, and according to Dreyfus search statistics, this is from the US, claim that around 85% of individuals on the autism spectrum are unemployed, despite a strong desire to work. If that is true, and I have no means of validating if it is, certain accommodations must be made to ensure these people have full access to the job market and become fully contributing members of society if they choose to do so. Considering skyrocketing autism rates, particularly in the US, where prevalence has moved from 1 in 50,000 approximately 60 years ago to 1 in 32 in modern-day California, addressing this issue is not really optional. If you care about the future for yourself and for your offspring, it'd be unwise to ignore this problem. Now, what we need to delineate is the underlying positive sentiment from how a burgeoning industry of consulting and training services aimed at fostering and promoting neuro-inclusive workplaces is going about its business. The business is good and it's only going to get better, while specific neurodiversity consulting market size data is somewhat limited. What I can tell you is that the overall diversity training market in the USA alone exceeds $9 billion annually and is projected to reach $30 billion by 2033. It's not an insignificant amount of money. It's the beginning of another industrial complex, because how can the DEI programs be labeled as effective and at the same time forecast this level of growth? It is absolutely evident that the DEI industry has now been institutionalized, and once an industry becomes part of corporate compliance frameworks, government procurement expectations, all kinds of nebulous HR performance metrics, reputational risk management, as well as investor ESG scoring, you have to notice it's not just a set of good intentions, it's a lot more than that. It's an economic infrastructure in its own right, and that makes it very, very sticky and completely immune to any form of scale down or dismantling. See, most industries have a clear value exchange. A mechanic repairs your car and you pay him money and the transaction ends there. Or you build a bridge and the job is considered done when it opens to the public. Now, DEI industry is different. It doesn't have clearly defined endpoints. At no point will we be able to say that we fully accommodated neurodiversity in the workplace and that now we're going to disband the industry and allocate that workforce to another important challenge. On the contrary, the targets will remain abstract, moving and at times totally unmeasurable, creating by design a mission that is perpetually incomplete. An industry that will feed off its failures using basic circular logic. If the training isn't producing measurable change, well, you definitely need more training. If your staff and management are resistant to training, well, that only proves you've not facilitated enough of it. If people disengage, it's an indicator of implicit bias. Order more training, make them complete more modules and so on. Lack of success reinforces the need for further and bigger investment. It's a great business model where key incentives are structured for permanence, not resolution. And it's very important to understand that as the key to today's episode. The incentives are everything and will bend any system to align to its needs and wants, disregarding the overarching vision to the detriment of the people that vision is trying to serve. In the aforementioned neurodiversity training session I had the pleasure to participate in, it was evident to me that the well-paid consultant was not merely trying to convince the group of the benefits of having a neurodiverse workforce, but was broadly speaking normalizing the entire spectrum of conditions, in line with the recent mainstream media messaging, which has conflated mild spectrum disorders with most extreme cases of autism. Why is that? What purpose can this normalization serve? On its surface, it prevents you from asking pertinent questions. Questions focused on root causes leading to neurodegenerative disorders. Questions focused on environmental toxins, environmental harms. No, asking questions would be insensitive. It would be an indication of intolerance. It would be the very proof point that more training and more normalization is required. My guest today is Sofia Karstens, and the reason why I wanted to interview her is the editorial titled Neurodiversity Is a Strawman, which was published on brownstone.org in April 2025. In the editorial, Sofia argues that the concept of neurodiversity has moved well beyond science and intercultural ideology, and now appears to be completely divorced from meaningful clinical or neurological distinction. Further to that, she critiques the shift from treatment of dysfunction towards a celebration of difference, even when that difference causes genuine distress. She also calls out the scientifically incoherent official messaging where being neurodivergent is at the same time a medical condition and a proud identity, morphing to suit its rhetorical moment. Sofia Karstens is an activist based in California who worked closely with publisher Tony Lyons and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on several projects, including Kennedy's most extraordinary best-selling book, The Real Anthony Fauci. She collaborates with several organizations in the legal, legislative, medical science, and literary spaces, and she's a co-founder of Free Now Foundation, which is a non-profit preserving medical freedom and children's health. Is neurodiversity an ideological shield that prevents honest engagement with real suffering? Let's dive in and find out. Sofia, how about we start with this? Was there a single moment or turning point that has fundamentally changed how you saw the medical or scientific establishment?
There was, and I think you'll find that with most people who are, I hate the word awake because it sounds condescending, but most people who have an awareness of the medical industrial complex, almost exclusively, I find, suffered an event. And that event could be an injured child, an injured parent, themselves. But something usually happened to make them run up against the real machinery that was real functioning. I think most people have a tertiary understanding of what you hear, the approved activism list, right? The farmer's the big bad wolf, and bureaucratic red tape, and the institutions, they don't know what they're doing, or there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Yes, all of those things are true. But if you actually go below those tertiary criticisms and you find what's really under those floorboards, that's when you usually realize that you've been in the upside down. And for me, that moment came when I am now in the shitty club of having lost a parent to the medical industrial complex. I lost my mother. She was diagnosed with Lyme disease. And if you know anything about Lyme disease, you know that she was first then distinctly not diagnosed with Lyme disease. And the fight to even get her properly diagnosed is a lesson in make it make sense. It's one thing to hit bureaucratic red tape, as we know. It's another when you finally get to the bottom of that infrastructure and they go after you. It's a whole other thing. So whether it's a parent of a child who was injured, who goes down the rabbit hole and finds the end of that thread and they get attacked, and then they're like, wait, this is not just the system isn't set up or bureaucratic red tape or government agency. This is something darker and way worse than anything that we previously expected or suspected. And my mother was diagnosed. We went through over a decade of misdiagnoses and mistreatments and surgeries and everything else that further weakened her, that you can't undo that damage. Ultimately coming to find out at the end of the line that she, in fact, was suffering from chronic Lyme, and 2 co-infections, which is usually the case with Lyme. Learning about how that misdiagnosis happened, how and why the treatment was not working, that we are dealing with a bioweapon at that level. This was all long before COVID. And fighting the system to try to save my mother's life, distinctly made the scales fall from my eyes as to what this animal really is. And then when COVID happened, it was very difficult because trying to keep both of my parents unvaccinated, and which I was able to do. But my mother's treatment for the Lyme, which was working, happens to be an effective treatment for another bioweapon that we all know of called COVID. And they ceased to be willing to treat her properly because she didn't have COVID. My mother never had COVID. No record does it show that she has COVID, but she needed the treatment for, in this case, exactly what it was designed for. It was not even an off-label treatment. But it happened to be saving patients from COVID. So they disallowed at a pharmacy level and all the way up to, we had physicians that were fired for treating patients instead of killing them. Institutionally, pharmaceutically, in every way, these treatments were disallowed. Even people who had, for example, an asthmatic condition that had been prescribed budesonide for decades, suddenly were disallowed from getting their medication because budesonide happened to be an effective treatment for the upper respiratory infections associated with COVID. So ultimately, we were unable to effectively continue the treatment. My mother backslid and she died in 2022. So while that moment fomented my willingness to pick up a sword and a shield and fight, I had been in those trenches long before COVID. And then when COVID happened, as we were discussing before your cameras were on, and we recently found out, I was immediately put on lists, and censored and banned and kicked off every social media platform. Now that Elon has purchased Twitter, I've been more active. There are other problems, obviously, with all of the social media platforms, but the mass censorship and the mass control over a dissenting voice was full force weaponry. And so I, at that time, was like, all right, well, all bets are off. I have nothing more to lose. I'm just going to, do it. So there was no defining moment where I turned, but I was prepared for that moment, having gone through what I went through. The missing puzzle piece for me, I was not confused at all about the medical industrial complex model, but the piece that I was missing was the vaccine piece, and that piece came to me in 2019 via Bobby Kennedy. So when I had that, I had the complete picture. So I had almost all of it. I was missing that piece. When that piece came into my puzzle, I realized it was not only a critical puzzle piece, it was actually the spear tip of everything that proverbial they have been trying to accomplish. So that was in 2019. So by the time COVID happened, and I have emails to people during all of 2019 saying, this is coming, this is coming, this is what's going to happen, long before anybody heard of COVID. And while I didn't know it was going to be that quick, we all, and by the way, we all looked at each other and we were like, wait, but are we sure could this really be happening? Like, there was a big part of us that were like, maybe we really are just crazy conspiracy theorists and maybe this won't happen. Or if it does, it won't happen in our lifetime. And then it did. And we all kind of looked at each other and we were like, wait, could we actually have been right? Like, let's go back and do the math again. Like, it's just not, you didn't want to believe it, even though we were the ones that were saying it. You didn't want to believe it. And everything from the mandates to the passports, to the, if you don't have your vaccine, show me your papers. You can't go into certain establishments. You can't get on a plane. You can't. I have emails saying exactly what they were going to do back in 2019. And I got called a crazy conspiracy theorist for saying that to people. Some of them are very famous people who called me a crazy conspiracy theorist that then I yelled at them back and said, oh, yeah, just wait in 10 years. In the next 10 years, this is what's coming. And then a year later, they said, bet you didn't think it was going to be 10 months. You're right. I didn't. But I was prepared because of my mother. So there was no defining second, but my mother had prepared me. Going through my mother's long trajectory of illness prepared me to, I think, not only process and know where to put the puzzle pieces as they were happening in real time, but prepared me to accept it, which I think is the biggest problem that we face. I think this is a really bleak, really depressing saga in which we find ourselves. And I think most people are reluctant to accept that, largely because depending on your country of origin, people don't know what they're looking at. And who's not confused about what's happening in this country is anyone from China, anyone from Eastern Bloc, anyone from any South American country that remembers our military industrial complex steaming in there and exploiting resources by enslaving people in debt, a model which works just as well enslaving our own people as it does other countries. They believe the false choice. Oh, well, there's a good choice and a bad choice. It's cake or death. Like, it's a good choice and a bad choice. And if you pick the bad choice, you're just stupid, not understanding that it's Sophie's choice every day, all day. At no time in history has a government that has taken rights from its citizens ever given them back voluntarily. But everybody just sprinted to totalitarianism, sprinted to, oh, we'll be able to go back to normal. Okay, take all my rights. And the people who don't understand the implications of that are the people that were, fighting the front lines against our front lines, saying, we're believing the propaganda, believing the narrative, we're killing grandma, you know, and so, and that is the model. So, I think I was particularly primed to accept that reality because of what I had gone through with my mother. I was not confused about the nature of our tyrannical government, even though I used to be the person screaming from the rafters from the other side. I'm a card carrying liberal elite, liberal academia snob. I'm a recovering Democrat now. But the DNC is not what people think it is. But I, having gone through that transformation, I do know what it is like to be on that side and to be susceptible to that again until I had an event. And no one was going to penetrate my bubble. No one was going to penetrate my rhetoric, my vitriol, my certainty, my conviction that we're the right ones and we're the good guys, because I had been fed that narrative. And so now, being on the other side of it, because I was primed, because I had my mother, so I was particularly equipped to accept that and incorporate it into my worldview, which has significantly changed, kind of done a 180. I now look at the people who are fighting us and saying, we're the we're fascists, we're extremists, we're, whatever, you fill in the blank, you know what they call us. So uh, looking at that, I go, there is no productivity in trying to convince someone to leave their bubble, because I know it would not have worked on me. And I know that it wouldn't have worked on me because people tried. And it was not until I went up against that machinery to try to save my mother's life that I realized, uh, I'm on the wrong side of this. This is not what we think it is. And that's a whole other psychological processing that most people would rather not. They just would rather not.
Yeah, because this would be a worldview shattering experience for a lot of people, and obviously most people would not want to experience that.
It really is. And I think it's terrifying for some people. They want to believe the lie. They want to believe, that it's, an easy choice. And, ask anyone who had to walk across Latvia whether or not that was an easy choice. Stay and die, leave and maybe die, maybe lose people along the way, or maybe survive. Those are your choices. Do you want to die by hanging or drowning? Because those are your choices.
I'm very sorry to hear about your mother going through that experience you've described for us. In your research, did you come across any evidence that the bacteria which causes Lyme disease was essentially engineered in a US military biolab?
Yes, I did. I came across that and everything else. So you're talking about Operation Mongoose, and but mostly what you can start to see is patterns out of a place called Plum Island, um, and the bioweaponry hub, as it were, in this country. There are other countries. Most people would curl up into a ball and cry forever if they found out what our government and every other government that is at our level is doing, and that is to say, weaponizing certain cancers and everything else. But at that time, Plum Island, which by the way is 3 miles off the shore of Lyme, Connecticut, um, for which Lyme disease is named. And they went through it, the normal trajectory. No, we're not doing anything. There's nothing there. Oh, well, there's something there, but we're not doing what you're saying we're doing. Oh, okay, we are doing what you're saying that we're doing, but we're taking all the safety precautions and it's not having the same implications. Oh, all of those things are also false, but there's no way that it escaped because it's an island and it's 3 miles. Yes, well, deer swim and birds fly. So, um, there are, even if we give everyone the benefit of the doubt and this was not deliberate, um, there are natural explanations and reasonable explanations for why this could have escaped if that's what happened. But also, you're not in control of pathogenic evolution after you create what we now call gain of function, but accelerated evolution. Um, you know, we we are behind the eight ball by definition when we create these things. And the part of the problem, this might resonate with some of your audience as deja vu, or at least rhyming with. The testing was specifically designed to not show what would be the most effective if we were trying to accurately test. The bands of the cycles were specifically designed to put people into one category or another. This also, some of your audience might remember, is reminiscent of the AIDS crisis and the AIDS epidemic. They're kind of a one-trick pony. We have a playbook, and this is not the first, the second, the third, or the 10th time they have done this. So Lyme disease has a sordid, long, chaotic history. It's very hard, like with all of these uh, concepts, to nail down the simplistic, oh, it went from A to B to C, and oh, okay, problem solved. We can all go home. That's all we have. That mystery completely solved. It's much more complex than that, because deliberately they drop a ton of chaos into the water. So if you get a cold and you take 200 things and you get better, how do you identify which of those 200 things made you better? This is the inverse of that. So it's really, there are so many aspects to this. There is an aspect, a corollary with AIDS and HIV research. There is a corollary with COVID. All of these accelerated evolution pathogens are problematic in too many ways to count, and they all interact with each other and your biome and the virome. There's an HHV4 and HHV6 connection. There's an oncovirus, which is HHV4 and HHV6 tend to be oncoviruses. Oncovirus connections, you know, the saying that nature loads the gun and you pull the trigger. Okay, well, in this case, we've got some propensities, some manufactured, environmental insults, agents. So you don't know if you've been, let's say, infected with something until the downstream agent designed to cross paths with that and become the environmental agent and trigger whatever the reaction is. You may not even know that that's what you're dealing with. They are so coordinated and they are so complex that it's impossible to nail down or identify one culprit and then, okay, problem solved, we can all go home.
That's really interesting. You know, when I talk to people like yourself, people who investigate these matters deeply and with continuous attention, it's really hard not to land the conclusion that a technologically advanced civilization has to be ultimately self-terminating. The way we use and evolve technology is kind of mad.
Well, and is it, I think about this often, is that Darwin in an anti Darwin society? If you are at the apex of a pyramid, meaning non third world, that is to say, we're not dying of no clean water and toilets, right? We are at the apex of a civilization pyramid, let's say, and we're not the only ones. But in that comes a lot of murkiness when it comes to true survival of the fittest, because we tend to not only provide places for that undesirable, let's say, genetic code to exist, we create the avenue for procreation of it. So it dilutes the gene pool, right? And that's not a judgment. That's not to say, you know, people don't have a right to exist, but there is a question philosophically that is undiscussed as to whether or not these kinds of actions and behaviors that we take force evolution, our human genome itself, to find another avenue to continue its prime directive, which is survival of the fittest. So, whether that becomes whatever it is that we take ourselves out from the inside, whether that's addiction, whether that's a psychological propensity or weakness, whether that's a physical propensity or weakness, whether that is um, technologically, you know, we become reliant on something and are then downstream unprepared when you take that away. Um, AI. Is it designed to, you know, dumb us down? Is it designed to make us more productive? Well, the friend who promises to help you move and then calls 5 minutes before and says, sorry, I can't. Well, you're kind of left in the lurch. This is that times 1,000. So, at what point, on what level do we determine? And it's not about a judgment of who gets to exist, but it is a conversation. At what point are we with these pathogens, with these bio alternatives, let's say? Um, you know, our systems, as I said earlier, designed, not only designed, but in fact, it is our very evolution to interact with the virome, with our microbiome, interacting with with the biome and the virome. So, what happens when we either redirect or halt our very evolution? What does that mean downstream? We have that question now with a vaccinated population, because let's, the easy and obvious hot button topic of the measles right now. Okay, so what used to be passed down from a mother, mitochondrial T cell immunity, to a child, uh, protected the child. But we have a largely vaccinated population for measles. So the people that are saying now, oh, measles is just the sniffles. Well, yeah, it used to be. But what have we done with our medical interventions that have actually redirected our immune response downstream in ways that we did not calculate? So maybe it's just the sniffles. We don't know that. We have a largely vaccinated population. There's no control for that. There's no study to see what happens if you suddenly take people off being vaccinated for a disease that before everyone was vaccinated for it was largely not harmful. Okay, but what does that mean when you do have a largely vaccinated population that did not pass down that T cell immunity? So all of these questions enter into the soup, and it's not just a straight trajectory, it's a web.
Yeah, ultimately, nothing lives in isolation, right?
There's nothing in a vacuum, not in this world.
Just mindful of time, as we've done 30 minutes and we've covered only one question. But I love it. Thank you so much for providing detailed answers. But let's press on with the remaining questions. You write about issues that draw enormous pushback from the media, from the scientific community, and even everyday people around you. What drives you to keep going, knowing the cost, and what has been the cost to you specifically?
Yeah, this is a very short answer. You'll be happy. We'll get to the next one. I don't have a choice. I wish that I could unsee and unknow what I have seen and know, but I cannot. So my choice is I can either put my head back in the sand and pretend I don't know, or I can pick up a sword and a shield and I can fight. And I don't know what the outcome is. I don't make predictions. But if the outcome is the trajectory that we've been on, and I didn't do something to try to stop it, Solzhenitsyn talks about this. We didn't love freedom enough. If I don't do something and we dive off a cliff and smash on the rocks below, I couldn't live with that. I can live with trying and failing, but I can't live with the other. And putting my head back in the sand is not an option.
That's very noble of you. Are you inspired by Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work?
Very much so, because, and I don't know if, well, sure, inspired, but I refer to it often because this is not a unique position for humanity to be in. 1984 was not a work of fiction. It was based on Stalinist Soviet Union. And the rewriting of history was institutionalized. And um, the younger generation grew up believing that was their history. Uh, you know, holy and historic pictures, 10 stories high in every office building showing Lenin and Stalin leading the Bolshevik Revolution, Trotsky nowhere in evidence. And um, the older generation, kind of political false memory syndrome, remembered something of the sort, but we just want to live out our lives. The middle generation developed what Orwell describes as doublethink, to make the accommodation between their own memories and what the establishment wished them to believe. Because half of that generation spoke out and said, that's not what happened. And they got dragged off to the gulags and executed. So the other half was like, how are we going to live with this dual reality? So Solzhenitsyn writes about, well, if you've read the Gulag Archipelago, but also even in Ivan Denisovich, he talks about what if, instead of cowering in the back rooms, we had picked up a sword and met them in the foyers with whatever fire irons and whatever we had. If that soldier was unsure that he would make it home, but we didn't, we cowered in the back rooms, and we simply deserved everything that happened after it because we didn't love freedom enough. So I take that to heart because I look at the trajectory of a lot of Eastern Europe, but that's not the only place. Um, But, 1917, uh, history doesn't always repeat, but it often rhymes.
Many of the cases you describe in the Neurodiversity Is, Strawman editorial that you've published on Brownstone are first-hand accounts of severe regression following vaccination. What responsibility, if any, do you think mainstream medicine has to take these anecdotal accounts seriously in forming research hypotheses?
Right. That's a complicated and good question. So, anecdotal, as you know, is not evidence, but you also can't use anecdotal on one side and not the other. So, Paul Offit's favorite argument is to say you can't use anecdotal and then proceed to tell you 12 anecdotal stories from the other side. But since these are all examples that I wrote in my article, but I have thousands of them, are reported to VAERS. They are not just anecdotal. They are what is called signals. So when you have thousands and thousands of these examples that are reported to a database, that's a signal. To dampen that signal to serve a narrative, or worse, an agenda, is to have policy dictating science, not the other way around. So there is not just an implication, there is an obligation of our health agencies to take these signals very seriously and to chase them down. There are a limited number of culprits to which these anomalies can be assigned, and it is negligent if our agencies do not use the proper data, all of the data that is involved, that is available, to be able to chase down these signals and determine what is correlative, what is causative, what is maybe not either of those things. And I will give you an example. If you see 200 people with yellow fingers and they all have lung cancer, you might be tempted to assign the yellow fingers as either causative or correlative to the lung cancer. But if you cut off the yellow fingers, the person still has lung cancer. Obviously, the yellow fingers were a signal that the person's a smoker, and that could be causative or correlative. So we need to chase all these things down properly. Proper cohort studies matter, proper surveillance matters. All of these data points matter. And something is anecdotal when it's me telling you I have a friend who such and such, but it ceases to become anecdotal when it becomes part of a database that is designed to capture signal and it is not followed.
You have to wonder, what is the point of these pharmacovigilance systems? The signal from VAERS in 21 and 22, in line with pharmacovigilance systems all over the world, was actually quite strong. The levels of harm was unprecedented, and I think it exceeded cumulative harm recorded since the system was first started in 1990, and that is absolutely insane. But there was no reaction at all. Mainstream just said, there's nothing to see here, just move along. Why did CDC and FDA simply not shut this thing down? I don't understand.
Well, asked and answered. The establishment doesn't have any interest in utilizing these systems for that which they are designed. And in fact, distinctly, they will dampen those signals, historically with any number of tactics, but most famously recently by taking away control groups. If we don't have proper cohorts and we don't have proper gold standard scientific study, then and you've muddied the water with enough data to dampen that signal by broadening the scope, which is largely what my article was, I would say implying, but flat out saying, which is if we can dampen the signal by muddying the water of neurodivergent with all of these other quasi neuro issues that may or may not be related to or caused by the same source, but we normalize that diagnoses, then it makes it very, very difficult to track down what's actually happening and what is actually causative and what is correlative. And that is why I call it a straw man. So we're arguing over a straw man. So all things can be true, but when you drop this stuff in the water, it only muddies the water. And, in my estimation, the directive by the establishment to dampen the signal and halt proper surveillance to capture any of it, which normalizes a DX, uh, urges everyone to jump on the narrative bandwagon instead of the let's find out the truth curious bandwagon. So it's siloed instead of 30,000 foot view. And also, meanwhile, one has nothing to do with the other. So there can be multiple types of intelligences or gifts or whatever you want to call it, so to speak. Howard Gardner says there were 14. And we can be neurologically damaging our kids and should maybe stop doing that, even though it has become super messy. And I will use the autism spectrum as an example, but nonverbal was the criteria mostly used, and was what is reflected in the numbers. However, there are some even conflicting. Science is a process, not a thing. It can be irreconcilable. It can be conflicting. So there are several others, often conflicting factors that enter into that equation. One is that when kids were diagnosed years ago, it was at a time when you had to fight for it. And it took years. We had thousands of examples where doctors were baffled for a long period of time. Usually there were a few incorrect psych diagnoses that didn't fit at all, but no doctor was willing to send you off without an answer, right? Even if it was the wrong one. So if a child didn't lose speech back in 2006, for example, it wasn't autism. And that was the case, even though they did regress from often being toilet trained and regularly smeared, had chronic constipation, and all of the associations that we now DX alongside autism. But conversely, people around the age of 40 today were often diagnosed as having, for example, ADHD or other behavioral diagnoses at maybe 5 or 6. Those kids were put on Ritalin, and it wasn't until they were maybe 18 to 20 that doctors started saying this was always wrong. It's a spectrum diagnosis, usually like an Asperger diagnoses. Those kids never lost speech, but they never emotionally matured past about like 11 or 12, tons of stimming, poor hygiene, but very empathetic, performed well in school. So both things are happening on both ends. Again, it muddies the water. But the reality is that this is all neurological damage, and we're probably causing most of it. So while there's no such thing as a genetic epidemic, so spectrum, no pun intended, notwithstanding, this is the result of an environmental insult. We know that. And again, as I said earlier, there's a limited number of culprits to which that can be assigned, whatever that may be. So it's not just vaccines/toxic soup cause autism. It's vaccines/toxic soup causes all the things that we diagnose as autism. So I do think that there is truth to the theory that they started diagnosing non-profound autistic children with autism on purpose to dampen the signal and water it down, so we would end up precisely where we are right now, discussing what is autism and what isn't.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I want us to get back to the anecdotal stories we've referenced a little bit earlier in the interview. There are so many of them. I mean, there's thousands of interviews with parents out there on CHD and other resources. So the question is, at what point do you think these anecdotal stories will be enough to form a pattern for the government-funded establishment?
Well, they do form a pattern. They do form a pattern. And that's what I was explaining earlier. That pattern is captured on databases like VAERS. And then we have sock puppets for the military industrial complex like Paul Offit going, oh, VAERS doesn't work. It's messy. Well, yeah, first of all, but also that's your job, Paul Offit. Presumably you can chew gum and walk and hold two things in your head at once. But also that's literally your job. But the other thing is, okay, so it's super messy, but it's also what you gave us. So if you had any actual vested interest in creating these databases and these systems to properly determine what these signals mean, then you would do that. But distinctly, you do not, nor does the establishment. Because why? It would confirm exactly what you do not want confirmed. They do show a pattern. There are clear patterns, hundreds and thousands of anecdotal with all the same story that are captured in a data capturing database is not anecdotal. That's a signal.
What is going on psychologically with these people? I mean, the Paul Offits of the world, the Stanley Plotkins of the world. At the end of the day, we talking about children, the future of civilization. I kind of refuse to believe it's about mega bucks for these guys. There's something else happening there.
I make it a habit to not try to climb inside the heads of psychopaths and try to see the inside of their heads. And I am unqualified to determine anyone's intention. But what I can say is we have a human, I think, as non-psychopaths, we have a human propensity or, desire to try to find the bad guy and, weed him out and string him up and, again, mystery solved, we can all go home. But the problem is there is no one person twirling their mustache in the mirror every morning. What we have is a system that is greater than the sum of its parts and far more powerful than any one individual in it. And when you have a system that is set up to be exploited and corrupted, there is always going to be an individual or individuals with moral elasticity who are willing to come in and exploit and corrupt a system that is set up to do that. And by that, I mean, we have regulatory capture that is off the charts, which is to say we have agencies, government agencies that are funded by the very industry they are charged with regulating. And we have corporate corruption. We don't have capitalism in this country. We have corporatism in this country. And it is a closed loop. And so while, people, there was a story I'm sure you heard a little while ago. People went after a CEO of a company, an insurance company, was shot and killed. But again, it's systemic. He didn't do anything other than that which his fiduciary duty required. The CEO of a polluting company would immediately be sued by his shareholders if he did not take the fine and continue with the bad behavior, because that is not fiscally responsible, because the system is set up to de-incentivize that behavior, and there's no accessibility and there's no accountability, and instead set up to incentivize all of the agency captured corporations and their cronies being in bed together. So it makes it very difficult. I think there's a spectrum, again, no pun intended. I think there's a spectrum of individuals. I think that sure there are, psychopaths who have no morals, and I think that's true. I think that there are people who get in too deep, and by the time they're in there, they may have started as what we call in our three-letter agencies, unwitting assets, but eventually they become witting assets, but there's nothing they can do, or they perceive that there's nothing they can do. I think that there are people who, just like the people on the outside, would rather not. I know physicians, for example, who got into the medical field because they wanted to help save people, and they went through everything and spent millions of dollars on getting their license, and they finally have their dream job, and they start to see what the medical institutions and the administrations do, and they basically are like, la 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 la, I don't want to know, because if I know, then I can't do, or in some cases, like, okay, I know it's not perfect, but like I can still do more good from inside. I think that there is an infinite spectrum in there, of people who, I don't think that everybody's a psychopath, but the people who rise to the ranks of making millions and billions, I think it's a combination of They're they are more expendable than they probably realize. So a lot of them are compromised. Um, there's compromise, there's or compromisable, there's corrupt, and then there's soldier soul. And I think that that spectrum, exists in everything in between.
Let's get back to your editorial, in which you draw a sharp line between neurodiversity and neurodegeneration. In your view, when does a condition stop being a form of diversity and become a form of pathology?
That's an excellent question. I am not a psychiatrist and I am not a physician, and I'm not a neurologist. But like with so many of these nebulous gray area conversations, abortion, um, we have to draw a less than arbitrary line somewhere. So, in my estimation, if you put me on a panel of think tank problem solve uh, people to try to start somewhere, I would suggest that if you're talking about a distinction between personality, indications of personality, we leave that out of the mix. We're not trying to diagnose and corral different personalities. I have a very hard time even with the DSM, and you're diagnosed as this personality disorder or that mood disorder or whatever it is. And I would suggest that if we're talking about a physical manifestation in a profound way, again, you can usually see those with the autistic community. If you're talking about a severe and provable, demonstrative handicap in ability to function, the degree, alcoholism is defined by its degree to which it limits your ability to function. And I think if we start to look at these neurological disorders, somebody has neuropathy, okay, they're not going to be going on, Social Security because they can't walk. But at what point do we make the distinction between like neuropathy in your fingers and you're paralyzed from the waist down? There's a Grand Canyon chasm in between those two things, but certainly they are related. So are we going to lump everybody in? No, we need to create obviously layers and levels of diagnoses. But I think the degree to which something affects a life at a physical and psychological level becomes a diagnosable and therefore treatable condition. Now, if there are medical tests also available to be able to diagnose something that is progressive before it gets to that point, fantastic. I'm for that. But as far as making the distinction between, so that we don't muddy the water, profound autism and someone who is whatever we're going to say, Asperger's or whatever on the spectrum, suddenly everyone's, kid is Rain Man. I think that we're, which I recently found out actually was not autism, but um, I think that we have to draw the line somewhere. It can't be arbitrary. It has to be based on some sort of knowledge that we do have while we continue to do the proper study to be able to untangle what this is and isn't. And again, that's not to say that these things are not correlative, that they are not related, that they are not on a, again, no pun intended, spectrum, but to lump a family who has a child at 27 who is not able to walk or use the toilet or manage life in any way alone, from to not distinguish that from a person who has maybe a different learning capacity or a different learning path. They learn differently than maybe someone else. That doesn't mean that it's actually a deficit in some cases. They're very fond of saying that these kids who have ADHD are, learning disability. I submit that's not a disability. I submit that is a kid who has a a big picture thinking program, and they are taking in a lot of information and trying to find where to put it, as opposed to being what Myers-Briggs would say is 87% of the population, which is focused on a detail. 13% of the population is big picture thinkers. I submit that ADHD is just big picture thinkers that don't have anywhere to put in, because the other people around them don't think that way. That's actually an asset, not a detriment. So I think untangling these diagnoses from diagnoses is the first step. We need to decouple divergence, differences from diagnoses. And I think the way to do that is, if it is a demonstrably physical and neurological disorder, chemical or otherwise disorder, you're on this side of the line. If it's something else, you're on this side of the line. And that doesn't mean we don't also put research and funding behind all of it, but you can't just throw it all in the same soup.
How do you think we should preserve the dignity of people with autism while also very rigorously investigating preventable environmental harms?
By decoupling those two concepts. One has entirely nothing to do with the other.
That's fair enough. How about this? If you had unrestricted funding and research freedom, if you like, what would be the first 3 studies you'd commission to investigate causes of autism?
Excellent question. The top 3, someone did a study about several years ago about the 11 or 12 culprits to which these illnesses, we'll call them, can be assigned. And there really are only about 11 or 12 of them. But in my estimation and my sort of research into all of those possible harms, everything can be categorized in 3 categories: pharmaceutical products, chemicals and endocrine disruptors, and EMF. Those are the top 3. Those are the top 3 studies. And they all have subcategories, multiple subcategories, and multiple sub studies. But those are definitely, in my estimation, that doesn't mean that there aren't other cofactors, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other things that need to be studied and potentially eliminated from our interaction with our environment. But I think those top 3, pharmaceutical products, chemical and endocrine disruptors, and EMF, are top of that list, because they also interact with each other in very harmful, toxic ways.
Oh, there's definitely some kind of an interplay between these 3. I've got a new question for you that just pops into my head as you were concluding your answer. I mean, I'm generalizing just to get the point across, and I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but it would appear that scientific community is stuck in the science of the big, meaning millions of dollars of funding need to be appropriated to X, Y, and Z in order to make a dent in something specific. In your line of work, are you encountering scientists who are conducting small-scale studies that are cheap and agile but still compliant with the scientific method? Are you meeting people like that?
Yes, well, I've known a lot of those people and continue to know a lot of those people, and that's kind of like all of us. We're the island of misfit toys. But I do, they do, and I do believe that we should always keep going with proper study, and they are qualified to do anything with nothing because they have been given nothing, because they are outside of the scientific community's narrative and agenda pushing studies, and they refuse to play. So yes is the short answer. They do believe that that is possible, and they do that, but usually at their own expense, and usually they all live very modest lifestyles, because every dollar that they have goes towards supporting um, their studies. And I would say that it would be wonderful if the same funding could go to the gold standard science people that is going to the captured science funding people. um, I do scientific study people. I do feel that if we could level the playing field for proper scientific study. And by the way, this is not pouring concrete on confirmation bias. We're not trying to suggest that we're right or that we know. We don't. The whole point is the side that is narrative driven is has um, abandoned first principles. And what we strongly believe is that we need to go back to first principles without a confirmation bias and not say, okay, we're right, you're wrong, or your experience over there is different than our experience over here. What we're suggesting is all of it matters. You don't eliminate half a data set because it doesn't suit your narrative. That's propaganda. That's not science. So, what has been happening is the fight to exclude the scientific community that you just described. We are not fighting to exclude the other side. We are fighting to include ours.
Do you have hope now that Bobby and Jay and others are in the wheelhouse that things will change? There's quite a lot of prominent players in the medical freedom movement, I'm sure you know this, that seem to be quite unhappy about the pace of change or lack of it. What's your point of view?
I understand that people would like it to happen in 30 minutes or less. Listen, it took us decades to get into this mess to get here. Eisenhower said it. Beware the military industrial complex. It took us decades to get here. It's going to take us decades to get out. There is no ship that spins around 180. And what Bobby and these people are doing is ticking the instrument panel 5 or 6 degrees. No one is going to feel that adjustment, but we will end up on a different continent.
That is such a good analogy to get your point across. I love it. You write in your article that the media is adept at keeping dots that should be connected in silos. Can you unpack some of the structural reasons, economic, political, or cultural, that you believe explain this state of play?
Yes, the media is the fourth branch of government. It pours concrete on the confirmation bias I was referring to before, and it discourages real world cooperation. So, first of all, television is the de facto education system in this country for the last 70 years. And most people take as gospel what CNN tells them is true. The Trusted News Initiative, the TNI, any of the legacy media. Luc Montagnier, who is a Nobel Prize winning scientist, he isolated HIV and won a Nobel Prize for it. One of the um, you know pinnacles of our scientific minds in global wellness, I would say. At the beginning of the pandemic, he came out and suggested that there were some issues with the testing and with what was happening with some of the studies with COVID and some of the murkiness, some of the muddying of the waters, what the insertions looked like. It was unlikely that this had evolved naturally. That was not virus pathology 101. And immediately CNN came out and said, no, no, no. Luc Montagnier is right. This is what those studies actually mean and actually say. So you have a journalist and a Nobel Prize winning scientist. Who do you think people listened to?
Well, decade-long conditioning has worked beautifully.
I would call it indoctrination, but yes. And it is conditioning to a certain degree too, though. It's an amygdala hijack. We are conditioned. I don't know. I think you're probably a bit younger than me, but you might remember from grade school, stop, drop, and roll, right? Like we had these little triggers that are designed to bypass our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's responsible for analytics and planning. So you're here, you want to get there, here's how you navigate the terrain. This data point comes in. Okay, how do I navigate around that? How do I incorporate that? How do I use that to get from where I am to where I want to go? It is not normal. I'm sure you experienced this during the pandemic. It is not normal when you bring up a data point to someone and they go bonkers and say, "Oh, I can't hear this," lose their minds. That's not normal. That's not a normal human response to a data point. That is amygdala. That is fight or flight. And fight or flight, 300,000 years ago, when a lion's bearing down on you, you don't have time for the analytics and planning to go, okay, I want to get from here to there. There's a lion coming at this trajectory. How do I? No, you go into fight or flight. Well, 300,000 years later, there's not a lion in sight, but our bodies don't actually know the difference. The body is flooded with those chemicals and it believes that there is a lion bearing down. And the media has dropped little conditionings. You heard they're killing grandma. It's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. It's I mean, look at what they did to Jews and gypsies in the 1930s, right? No, I'm absolutely not kidding. They were demonized. It's the dehumanization. So that's the tools the Nazis used. It is the dehumanization of an entire sect of your human cohort that allows for that amygdala hijack to go, oh, fight or flight, be afraid of that. So they set it up, they lay the tricks. A person called David Atlee Phillips actually wrote this portion of the CIA manual, how to do this, how to get a functioning democratic society to willingly relinquish all of its rights to a totalitarian regime. And this is one of those steps, is you lay the tracks for downstream all of these bombs to be set off, and it works. So psychologically, we have a population that is unprepared, uneducated, and not, I don't mean generally uneducated, although newer generations that too, but I mean ignorant of, they're uneducated as to the details, the scientific inquiry into the details of what they're actually saying. They're just regurgitating what they heard on CNN. They unprepared, uneducated, and in fear because there's an amygdala hijack in the water. So in that scenario, in that framing, it is very difficult to have a reasonable, rational conversation about truth and fact and data points with anyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In your editorial, you wrote the following statement: "We cannot produce caregivers as fast as we are producing people with autism." Now, this is a provocative claim, so can I ask you to expand on the moral, economic, and political implications you see here?
Percentage of autism diagnoses in this country has skyrocketed. Something is causing it, right? So if we continue down this road, who's going to be available to care for the diagnosed? If that continues, and it has not shown any sign of even plateauing. But if you look at the hockey stick of diagnoses, now again, we can get into the muddied water of like what constitutes a autism DX. But if you're talking about profound autism, as I explained earlier, being that distinction where an individual is not able to care for themselves, and we're looking at an increase, sharp hockey stick increase of autism diagnoses in this country. If we don't identify what is causing it, it's just going to keep going. So who will be left to care for those individuals if we don't figure out what the problem is and start solving it? I mean, I do think it's kind of simple math.
Oh, I agree with you. I think the math is simple, but why is this not the biggest, the most urgent health emergency in the world right now?
You would think, well, I don't know about the most, but it certainly should be on the radar. And I think it is. But again, there is a lot of money to be made. You were saying earlier, it can't just all be money. I think people underestimate how much money is at stake. And again, it's not a person, it's a system. And it is a power system, and it is a money system. And, to expose this pillar of, this is not the only pillar, but to expose one, presumably, potentially, could expose any of the others. That is what Bobby and people like Jay are trying to do right now. It's why there are weapons trained on them from all sides. Um, it's why there have been multiple attempts on lives. The animal that is the head of this Hydra is going to fight to the death. So, yes, should if we the faulty presupposition is that everybody's on the same page of wanting to solve the problem. But if you created the problem, it's a macro version of the NGO model, right? If your business model is built on solving a problem, and you solve that problem, no more job. So we have all these NGOs that are trying to solve anything from the homeless problem in California to the fentanyl problem also in California. Yeah, that's not going to get resolved. If you saw the PSA that was the movie Traffic, you understand that these are not problems that we want solved. We want to make money off solving them, and we want to create downstream. You were diagnosed as this. Well, I have a pill for that. Oh, this pill also causes these 12 other things. Well, we have 12 pills for those too. Now you're a customer for life. Oh, we didn't know this caused this. Well, now you have to be on that too.
Well, this is why I said earlier that this model is ultimately kind of civilization terminating.
I do too. I don't disagree with you.
That's deeply depressing, but let's keep things positive and move on. Let me ask you this. Do you think there's a deeper philosophical reluctance, maybe, in modern liberal democracies to accept this possibility that large scale health policy decisions may have gone disastrously wrong? What do you think?
Yeah, there is a delusion that we are not already off the fascism cliff. Um, I hear people saying that all the time, like, oh, we need to prevent fascism. We're not fascist, whether it's the right saying that about Biden administration, whether it's the left saying about Donald Trump. I have really bad news for everyone. We are already off that cliff. Um, in our country right now, the treatment that you receive for an illness let's say you go into a hospital, that treatment is called a standard of care, and it comes down from the CDC. So what that means is your physician, and if you try to deviate from that, if your physician tries to deviate from that, there were bills AB 2098. There are assembly bills and Senate bills and laws that prevent people from prescribing or advising outside of the standard of care. It happened during COVID. When that didn't work, the pharmacy simply said, "We're not honoring your prescribed treatment options." Um, what that means is that you are not actually in control of your body and what happens to it. Your physician, your caregiver, not in control of your body and what happens to it. A government agency is in control of your body and what happens to it. And there is a word for that, and that word is fascist. And the fact that it doesn't alarm every American, they just can't see the forest for the trees. They're so close to the tree that they can't not only even see the tree, they can't see the bark. They can't they 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 don't understand that we're already off that cliff.
Sophia, you criticize the idea that we should always prioritize the weakest subset of our population. What is your ethical framework for thinking through societal trade offs?
I think the word prioritize is the problem. So no one is suggesting that we throw a minority subset to the wolves, but helping, and that is questionable because who determined what is helping, right? What government agency determined what is helping? Is putting kids on mind altering or hormone altering drugs as minors at age 5 and 6. Is that helping? It's questionable. Uh, but let's give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and say that the system isn't being gamed, which it is. No one is suggesting that we don't help a minority subset, but helping a minority subset at the expense of a majority is not an equation that makes sense in any capacity. Nowhere. This happened during COVID. You have to take the vaccine to prevent someone else from getting. Okay, nowhere in our Constitution or in our pillars of medicine does it suggest that one person is obligated to take on a known harm to prevent someone else's potential risk of downstream harm. Nowhere. That is absurd and ridiculous. So the word priority is the problem. I think we should prioritize all of it. What I have a problem is doing one at the expense of the other, even if it were the other way around, by the way, even if it were helping the majority at the expense of a minority. I have a problem with that. That's not a solution that makes sense to me in any frame. And I think we can do better if we can, have cars that basically drive themselves. We should be able to come up with better solutions than prioritizing one over the other. So I have a problem with prioritizing the majority at the expense of the minority. But under no circumstance does helping, again, a minority at the expense of the majority make sense.
We've briefly talked about this already, but I'm wondering if you've got anything to add. What do you think a true regulatory reform should look like in your view? Do you believe it's possible to change things within the current institutional structure, or does it all require a more fundamental rethink?
The only solution is no more captured government agencies, no more regulatory capture, no more corporate corruption. So that revolving door, closed loop revolving door of corporatism at the expense of the American people, on taxpayers' dollars, by the way, it's a fun little additive, has to be done away with.
US is obviously a highly litigious society. You've got people suing each other for the most ridiculous things. Taking that into consideration, and given where we are now, medically, culturally, and politically, what would meaningful accountability look like for families who believe they were harmed? I'm asking you this because if the current US administration is successful removing their liability shields, the volume of lawsuits that would pour into the system would surely sink a substantial part of US economy, which sure as hell is not something that's going to be allowed to play out. What do you think is the best, most just way to move forward here?
I have a couple of answers to that. One of them is the more esoteric answer, and then I'm going to also go into a little bit of the legal strategy for that. It's an excellent question, and it's one to which I don't have a simple answer, mostly because there isn't one. But as I was saying before, it is course correct. So we are laying strategic infrastructure for the course correct, and we have to start somewhere. So like the ship, right? We are, if we continue on the wrong course, then all hope is lost. So step one is what I was suggesting: unwinding the regulatory capture and all of that corporate corruption that exists at all levels of our government. It's true what you said about us being a litigious society, but also our legal system is pretty great in a lot of ways when it is utilized properly. It was not so during the pandemic. You got the guy, he's kneeling over the body and covered in blood and holding a knife, and the DNA checks out and he admitted it, but darn the luck, we're just not prosecuting murders this week. So that was problematic. But when everything was working, we actually have a pretty great legal system as the last bastion, I think, of accountability in this country. And continuing on the wrong course without a course correct is a hopeless cause. So we do need to lay this strategic infrastructure for the course correct. Knowing that, I don't know if you know how the cigarette companies ultimately started to lose cases. But it was a very, uh, it was a burden that was barely met by the skin of their teeth, but how they did it was quite ingenious. And I think that ultimately we are going to start at this level, the state's level, and then the dominoes will fall. What happened in that case? People had been going after the cigarette companies for at least a decade. And they had a formulaic answer that always worked. No one ever won. Very hard to prove, just like with vaccines. Very hard to prove that someone did or didn't cause your health defect, death, loved one's death, whatever it is. And it is true of vaccines. It is impossible to prove that someone did or didn't die from a vaccine. So it is very problematic. The downstream, and then of course add the fact that there is liability shield anyway. But the reality is, I think opening the door is going to come from an unlikely place. And what happened in the cigarette cases was an AG out of New York. It was an attorney who thought of this, approached an AG out of, it was either New York or New Jersey, and I'm going to forget which one. What they did was they changed the burden and therefore changed the outcome. So when you're trying to prove that you didn't cause my cancer or you did cause my cancer from your product, a bevy of, like I said, formulaic, well, you had this comorbidity, or well, you did these other 3 carcinogenic, whatever. It never worked. The AG agreed to go after the cigarette companies for the fiscal responsibility that fell on the state for the indigents, which at that point was, I think, 19%. They won that case. That case was the landmark case. It's called a landmark case, after which it was the case law precedent that all of the other cases for the cigarettes, people going after them. And listen, there's still cases going on today, and some of them last decades. So we're not saying it's perfect, but that was the door opener. That landmark case set the precedent for everything that came after it. So I think what we are looking at in the case of medical products is a similar landmark case that has to open the door, and then we can start to see those dominoes fall using a different burden. Because I think that it's, even if we are somehow able to conclusively prove this connection, which I do have hope we will eventually prove, the liability is, you can't retroactively go back and undo when they had liability shield and exemption during that period of time, number one. And number two, you can't retroactively go back and tell someone that they should have known something that they couldn't possibly have known at the time. Now, those studies were disallowed, but which is why they needed plausible deniability to hold up in court. But they won that round. They have it. They have plausible deniability. So we're going to have to find another way to hold these companies accountable. And I think that could look an awful lot like what happens with the cigarette companies.
Do you think it's possible to remove that liability shield? Is that something that will happen?
It's very complicated, and it is. Yes, I do. It is going to require a lot of machinery. There are a lot of components. It's going to require a Herculean effort. I believe they're going to do it. It's going to be messy. It's going to be messy. There are pros and cons on both sides, and like with everything, some of the cases that the pharmaceutical industry makes are absolutely absurd and ridiculous, and paid for by lobby, paid for by industry pressure, and to serve their bottom line. But it is also true that some of their arguments are true enough in that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and dismantle incentive for productivity and incentive for innovation. So there is an argument to be made. We just have to be careful in the way that we untangle things, because you don't want to cut the wire that blows up the whole boat.
What are the most constructive ways parents, researchers, and advocates can initiate the conversation without being sidelined or vilified? What I mean here is that for people who are well read, they've studied the papers, the data, they've memorized the abstract, and are awake to the severity of the problem and want to discuss these matters with someone who is not, wanting to nudge them a little bit towards a more complete view of reality, view of the world, if you like. How do you get past that initial reaction that has a tendency to completely freeze the conversation altogether?
That is above my pay grade. I have not figured out how to do that yet. And like I also said at the beginning, the spouting of rhetoric and indoctrination, I was one of those people. So I know how impossible it would have been to penetrate that. Uh, I don't have the answer. I don't know. I look at it like, there's the uh, there's the far extreme right and there's the far extreme left, and then there's the movable middle. And I think that the movable middle is actually the Grand Canyon. I think that there's a lot more of those of us that fit in that category than that fit in the category of either extreme. But I also have learned that trying to talk to either of those two extremes is unproductive at best. Um, and it's not a majority percentage, but I call them the lost contingent. Um, I don't. Um, I have yet to uh, experience any progress with them. I've experienced progress with the movable middle, and I think that identifying who's who is probably the first step in, not wasting your time. Um, if you this is a terribly derogatory towards extremists, but that's fine. Uh, I find that they are sock puppets in that, you remember those dolls in like the 70s and 80s where like you pull the string and it says like one of five things, right? So I find that if you pull their string, they say one of five things. It really doesn't matter what you say to them or whether the one of the five things has anything to do with what you said. Like they really just only say five things. And I think identifying, people are calling them lately NPCs, and I do think that's weirdly accurate. No, but it is, and not in an insulting way, and I don't mean literally, but I mean in the way of like they are programmed, again, only one of those five things. Like they don't, outside of the framing of their programming, they short circuit. They can't, it takes experiencing something outside of that vacuum to understand that you're outside of that vacuum. You can't tell AI it's AI, right? Like it's like that. So I think that the first thing is identifying if there's someone who is falls into that category and it's like they freak out and they only say one of five things and they have their amygdala hijack, and don't waste your time. So just don't waste your time. But if there are people who are curious, like, hey, do you know anything about this, that, or the other? I do find that turning a fire hose on people is not effective. When you get emotional or you get um, uh, passionate about it, it doesn't really help. I have found that there are a couple of, you know, um, books that are, when someone asks me like, what do you know about this data? Oh, you know what? Ed Dowd wrote a really great book. It's called Cause Unknown. It's really easy to understand. You don't have to be a Wall Street guy or numbers person to understand it. I highly recommend reading that book. Or, do you know anything about this, that, or the other? And then you point them over target of a book that is good. But I kind of deal with my conversations the same way, like, oh, if someone asks you a question about something, I tend to use Socratic method back and be like, oh, well, why do you think that? Why, where did you hear that? Or what made you ask that question? And then they usually, oh, well, my sister was diagnosed with this soft tissue breast cancer, and she's like the third one in my family. And I was wondering if there's any correlation. Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of our specialists, you don't jump the, oh my God, it's a Sigma 10 event. Everybody's going to die. And like, you don't do that. You don't go, Ryan Cole was 4-1 in 6 months, and now it's 6-1, and it's like a 10 standard deviation. And you don't do that. You go, yeah, that's interesting. A lot of our experts are seeing that. So you're not alone. In fact, 1 in 25 people now, 25% of people, that's 1 in 4, actually have experienced the same thing that you are. So you're not alone. You're not unique. And I think that there's a lot of people that are asking these questions. What do you think about A, B, and C? And just keep asking them questions. So I find that to be, again, for the movable contingent. The lost contingents are lost. Don't waste your time. This is not the no man left behind. You're getting left behind. you're left behind. Sorry.
That's actually really good guidance. Thank you very much for that. I've got one last question for you, and it's about hope. What gives you hope? Are there any researchers, journalists, or maybe even institutions that you think are starting to ask better, bigger questions and are producing more consequential, positive outcomes?
I'm very glad that you are doing this. I don't know. Media is a tough one. Bobby gives me hope. Jay gives me hope. Donald Trump gives me hope. Donald Trump is difficult because he comes in a problematic package that makes it hard to defend. Um, there's a great politician who said, if you agree with 5 out of the 10 things I stand for, you should vote for me. And if you agree with 10 out of the 10 things I stand for, then you should seek professional help, because that's not reasonable. And that is kind of what I feel about Donald. I don't agree with everything. And he's difficult because he's him. But he is doing a lot of really great things, and he is taking bullets for doing them in a way that he never would have before. And it is selfless. And, people don't understand. Everybody's armchair quarterbacking, and everybody thinks they have all the information, but they actually have almost no information about the weaponry that's trained on him. And it's like the person who answers the door and tells you to go away because they've got a gun to their head and you can't see that that's what's happening. Everybody thinks that they know why he's acting in certain ways, and they don't necessarily. But it's not. You can't describe what target you're over without giving away your location to the enemy. So there's a lot of that going on. But he does give me hope as well. But mostly, um, Bobby, I believe, is going to and is making significant change. Um, but I would caution people, you know, states' contributions cannot be overstated. It's really great that our guys are in there. Um, for a little while, whatever kind of road open federally that means, great. Um, but I caution against relying on federal diktats, because what happens when it's not our guy in there? And then stuff just gets wound back and forth. But the real reality is, um, no one's coming to save us. Not Bobby, not Donald Trump. No one's coming to save us. So we have work to do. And you know, the boots on the ground fighting for states' rights in the judicial and legislative realms are truly the answer. Locking these things in congressionally, bottom up, is the answer. And um, the tremendous heroes that I know that are doing that work in the States, people like Tara Thornton and Denise Aguilar in California, um, and many, many, many others, um, their contribution cannot be uh, overstated either. And that gives me hope. Um, Candidates like Steve Hilton, who is our gubernatorial candidate for 2026 in California, common sense candidates that are uncaptured, give me hope. Um, so it's a coordinated effort, and it takes a village, right? Like we're all linked arms in the foxhole. So there's no white knight that I feel like, oh, this person's going to save us. Great. We can dump it all in their lap and go home. you know, um, Everybody has to pick up a sword and a shield because no one's coming to save us. Um, Not this party, not that party. There's no such thing. We have a lot of work to do. And the sheer volume of people who are willing to stand up and do that work gives me more hope than almost any other single change that can be made by any person.
I'm really glad you've said that. Positive outlook is really what it's all about. Are you working on anything interesting at the moment? Any big projects in the works at all?
I write pretty uh, prolifically for Brownstone, especially lately because there's just been a lot going on, and sometimes that translates into like Zero Hedge and other Epoch, other publications. But mostly what I'm working on, I have a super PAC and I am supporting Steve Hilton for gubernatorial for 2026. And also I'm involved with my nonprofits in legislative and judicial and grassroots lobbying efforts in ballot initiatives in the state in California. As I said at the beginning, California is the beta test state, and we need to fight what's happening here. And I believe the magic sauce, um, kind of like with relying on the federal government, if we only go after them judicially, lawsuits or whatever, or only go after them legislatively, then stuff just gets wound and unwound every 2, 4, 6 years. And then there's challenges and nothing ever happens. But if you can coordinate those two to set case law precedent and lock in ballot initiatives and fight the bad bills congressionally and legislative initiatives that lock in states' rights and benefit the people instead of our corrupt agencies. If you can lock that in congressionally, then that will translate to the rest of the country and quickly. California is not a blue state. California has 3 counties that carry the state blue, and that is Marin, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Um, but like every other swing county, I don't believe in swing states. I believe in swing counties. Um, Swing counties are really a nugget surrounded by many puddles. So if you can peel away, if you look at a heat map and you peel away, you actually see that not only is the state red, but if you flip, let's say LA County, not even you don't even have to win. You just have to not lose by a certain percentage. The state will flip red, and I do believe that is necessary right now to get us back on course. The fact that we're a uniparty is another conversation for another day. But right now, the DNC is driving the car, so we need to pry their claws off the steering wheel and take their foot off the accelerator if we're going to save ourselves in this state. And if we can do that, I do believe that the rest of the country will follow suit.
That's pretty cool. How can people support your work? How can they donate money and become a part of the solution?
My super PAC is called the Decentralize America Super PAC. Unfortunately, um, although fortunately, this is one rule that that I agree with and I do like, because we don't necessarily need foreign entities and foreign corporations dictating our elections. But super PACs are prohibited from taking money from foreign nationals or foreign corporations. So the alternative would be to donate to my nonprofit, which is also Decentralize America. Those are the two places I'm on. I'm on social media. You can find me. I try to stay as invisible as possible because I've been a target so much, but I'm there. I'm Sophia J. London on Twitter.
Sofia Karstens, this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today.
Wonderful to talk to you, and thanks so much for all that you do.
The mainstream neurodiversity discourse, particularly in HR and consulting circles, has shifted entirely towards inclusion, accommodation, and celebration of difference. That does sound benevolent, and at times it is. The good intent is there, and where it is authentic, it should definitely be acknowledged as a positive. But at the same time, what is also happening is that this positioning explicitly sidelines questions like, why are so many children and adults now neurodivergent? Or has something changed in the environment, in food systems, in gestational health? Such questions are inconvenient, politically extremely risky, and most certainly financially threatening, especially to big food, big pharma, and big agrochemical industries, which, as most of you will know, are extremely powerful corporate entities. So instead of open and transparent conversation, the operating paradigm is limited to embracing how different people are wired and not ever asking what wired them that way. For more information, please take a look at the links in the show notes and make sure you read Sofia Karstens' Neurodiversity Is, Strawman as the key to today's episode. Thank you very much for listening and see you next time.